Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impacts these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. All right, today we have a great show for you. We are going to look at the effects of COVID-19 and what the impact it had on the industry and on consumers. Today we have two brilliant ladies joining us from our research team here at New Frontier Data. First up is our Director of Industry Analytics at New Frontier. Please welcome Dr. Molly McCann. Welcome back, Molly. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And our next is our Senior Director of Industry Analytics. Please welcome Kacey Morrissey.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I should say welcome back because you guys have both been on the show before. All right, well, we have a lot to cover and lots of good info to get through, so we're going to dive right in. The San Francisco Chronicle reported as San Francisco sales tax receipts sag, cannabis is riding high. So the city controller's office said it's the only locally imposed tax doing better than we projected. The recent report projected that local cannabis excise tax exceeding the budget amount by $700,000, which is in sharp contrast to the city's overall local sales tax receipts, which is based on the controller data again, and it's decreased by 23 million compared with the same time period in 2019. So Dr. Molly, we'll start with you. What are some of the interesting trends that we're seeing over the past month in terms of sales, average spend?
Yeah, so the short answer is that it keeps increasing. We saw an increase way back, last time or first time I was on here in March, we talked about the increase in spending. We assumed that it was going to be a little bubble. It was, people were stocking up because they weren't sure what was going to happen with the pandemic, and it's just kept increasing since then. So we did an analysis. We looked at 14 different legal markets in the US and saw that the increase in average spending per consumer between March of this year and October of this year was up $149. So that's $149 more per month on average that consumers in those 14 markets were spending since March. So I don't know what to say. It's a lot. It's a big increase.
Well, I think it was like 2 weeks to flatten the curve and everybody was like, all right, let's stock up. And now it's like, dear God, when will this end?
And they're continuing to stock up. Yes.
Exactly. Well, as far as that, how has the consumption of cannabis changed during the pandemic? So I know you are the expert of all things consumer data, just as far as response to COVID-19 and their behavior.
Yeah, so I think that the two main things to talk about are an overall increase in consumption and a shift in product forms. So the big story is that we looked at annual consumers, people who consume at least once a year, and saw that 42% of them said that they've increased their consumption of cannabis overall during the pandemic. And 18% of them said they increased it by a lot. And then we have, about the same amount, 42% said it stayed the same, and only 16% said they've decreased the overall amount of cannabis that they use. So what that means is that overall, there's more people are consuming more cannabis in general, but then among certain segments, it's significantly larger. So people under 55 years old, it's half of consumers say that they've increased their consumption. And actually parents with children under 18 years old have also reported an increase. 56% of parents who are consumers who have children at home say that they're now consuming more cannabis.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, my kids, speaking of someone with two little kids, at least my kids are in school. I can imagine someone trying to work and then also homeschool. Yeah, and I wonder if it's a mix between having just like anxiety or also just maybe boredom. I mean, you don't have any place to go, you have nothing to do. So I wonder what's the driving factor behind that?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that both of those are happening. And for different people, it might be different, a combination of different factors. But the being at home more is certainly involved in the shift we're seeing in product forms. Flower is seeing the largest gains in product form, which originally, it might seem a little bit confusing because with concern around COVID-19, which primarily affects the lungs, or really notably affects the lungs, even though it's a circulatory system disease, initially people might have been concerned about, inhaling potentially, damaging material into their lungs. But I think that the reason that we're seeing more use of flower is because people are at home more, and where before people would consume vapes, to be less conspicuous and have something less smelly when they're consuming outside of the house in public. People are not outside of the house anymore. So if you don't live with people that you're trying to hide your consumption from, flower is, it's also a more economical choice if you buy it in larger quantities. So that's something we're seeing also, is increase in flower over other product forms, especially over vapes.
What about things like pre-rolls?
Pre-rolls of small size pre-rolls are I think they're maintaining where they are generally. Those bigger pre-rolls, which people would buy on their way out to something social to consume with other people, those sales of those have dropped off.
I find it hilarious that it's flowers going up, because I feel like if you do have kids under the age of 18, I would think that you try to be more conspicuous about consuming, or if it's just like COVID-19's here, it's like, surprise kids.
Yeah.
I smoke weed.
Don't have the bandwidth to hide it anymore.
I know. Or just be like, the cat's out of the bag, I can't do it anymore. That's really interesting. Because I would have thought that, I know in the beginning, I think we saw an uptick in edibles, and I thought that would be one of the driving factors, right? You want to be able to consume around your children without having to smoke and have it be in the house. But it's kind of interesting to see the opposite happening. Any other like consumer data that we should know about that's changed over from COVID-19?
I mean, there's a lot of minor points. We have a report coming out at the beginning of December that goes into it in more detail. So I would just point people toward that report. A lot of fun stuff in there.
Awesome. All right, well, moving on, Forbes.com reported the 5 new cannabis markets are predicted to create over 26,000 jobs. So it looks like the one undisputed winner from the 2020 election is cannabis, with new markets coming on in Arizona, Mississippi, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota. And according to this article, they are predicted to create over 26,000 jobs by 2025. So Kacey, I'll start with you. In the several states where legal markets existed prior to the pandemic, cannabis was deemed, an essential business. How does that affect industry outlook from a business and policy perspective?
Well, I think, just the standard of calling a cannabis business an essential business is just such a far point ahead of where we were, just 2 years ago. I don't think anyone who worked in the industry could imagine that they'd be deemed essential businesses. I think it does a lot as far as validity of the industry. They deemed all these businesses essential, and then following them being called essential, we saw, blockbuster sales. It was one of the one parts of the economy that didn't suffer during the pandemic. And I think that just bodes really well for legalization as it spreads across the US. I mean, we're really not putting the toothpaste back in the tube per se. Medical markets aren't going away. There's over 3 million patients registered for medical cannabis programs in the states where they're legal. And with this election, with 5 new states being added to the bunch, I mean, the growth is going to be incredible. Right. Specifically in New Jersey, just sort of breaking open the eastern seaboard is going to be vital. I mean, we saw in the West, Colorado made the first move, and all the states around it. It really is about border states and sort of the governments of those states recognizing not only tax revenue potential, but also understanding the size of their own illicit markets and the impact that it has when border states legalize. And this is, particularly true for a state like Pennsylvania and I think New York, which have both had discussions around legalizing cannabis for adult use, and both currently have medical programs. Pennsylvania has a medical program where they've built out sort of their projections for what growth and what sales are going to be through 2025. And that, that projection was built without the consideration of New Jersey going recreational, and potentially cutting into those, the patient growth that we would have seen in Pennsylvania and even New York. So I think breaking open that eastern seaboard with New Jersey legalizing, I think we're going to see some really interesting things start to happen in the Northeast. I think we're going to see, legislation, and we're going to see movement and legalization in some states quicker than we might have expected.
Yeah, I'm from New York. And so my mom, I think when she's gone up to Massachusetts to visit family, she said that there's like a dispensary right off the New York, Massachusetts border where there's a dispensary, and there's like literally a line to get off that exit. So having New York City be so close to New Jersey, I feel like New York City's got to get on it before they lose out on all these people just leaving the city to go to Jersey, since it's so transient, so easy to get to. It's so easy to pop over, even from DC or Maryland. I mean,
yeah, even the powers that be that are anti-cannabis and that have fought against the motion of legalization for so many years, the arguments that they have left in their tool belt are just diminishing. It's very hard to argue in a time of economic necessity where you need tax revenue, in a time where every state around you is legalizing. It becomes much harder to argue for prohibition at this stage in the game. So I think we're going to see some really interesting things happen over the next year.
Yeah. Well, just speaking of, all these states coming online, it does seem like, there was a lot of red, a lot of blue states coming online. Do you think that's going to really open up the doors for a federal legalization conversation in the near future?
Yeah, I think the fact that cannabis legalization has such bipartisan support, and you look at a state like Montana and South Dakota passing adult use right now, I think it's so huge. Just to see states that are so historically conservative, the people who are voting still, they stand, on the majority stand on the issue of, or stand to legalize. I mean, that's what they want. It's just, I think that the federal government, they've gotten pressure from the industry for years now to do something about cannabis, whether it be descheduling off Schedule 1 or, fully legalizing. There's been pressure all around for years, but I think that pressure is being built to a point where I don't think they can turn away. I think they're going to need to do something, especially because they put decriminalization in their public platform for this year, Biden and Harris I'm talking about, and just, the extra pressure from both red and blue states voting on this issue, the spread of legalization to such high population states. It's not easy to ignore, and they've already put steps in place. They put the word out there that they're going to be paying attention to it. So I think we can actually expect a little bit of movement there. What type of movement is still TBD at this point. Whether they put it Schedule 2 or what their plan is still to be determined. But I definitely know that the federal government is feeling the pressure, and we're going to see something on it soon.
Yeah, we had on a previous episode, we talked about how some of the smaller companies that are building up right now actually would prefer not to be federally legalized because they're going to get crushed by these big companies coming in. I mean, they're these massive companies that want to come in and just blow out everybody else, but they've been waiting for federal legalization to happen. So it seems like there's kind of a push and pull on this, because some people that are in the industry and building up their brand, building up their businesses, they would rather not have this happen. Have you guys seen anything like that in the data that you guys look at?
Not necessarily the data, but more just, I mean, that's been the concern across the industry, and from the very early days, even the way that they've written regulations around protecting smaller businesses or preventing out of state ownership or things like that, where they really are trying to protect smaller business owners, in those states from being taken over by bigger companies that have, the logistics built out, like the Coca-Colas, the Monsantos, everything. So I wouldn't say that we've seen it in the data per se, but it's a hypersensitive issue in the industry, smaller players versus bigger players.
Yeah, and we all know that working in the cannabis industry, it's like dog years. I mean, it is like a gritty business. You have to be able to like get in there and grind. It's not, I feel like, the green rush or gold rush that people think. These people have like put blood, sweat, and tears in. So just it all gets swiped away. Well, and then my last question, what is about the social element of cannabis consumption that's changed? Just because, Molly, you had touched on, people are a lot more doing this at home and not in social settings. And you mentioned the pre-rolls about people using them smaller. Is that, do you think that's going to be like a continue after this pandemic?
I don't know. I mean, one of the only good elements of what we've been through this year has been that we're going to learn a lot about human behavior. I mean, this has been a kind of social experiment that we could not have imagined ever having to experience. And, I'm fascinated to find out what is going to happen in terms of these changing behaviors. In terms of what we do know about social consumption and changes in social consumption, as you said, more people are consuming at home, more people are consuming alone. There's a certain segment of consumers before the pandemic who only ever consumed with other people. And we see that a third of those consumers, even if they were regular consumers, haven't consumed cannabis since the pandemic started, because that's how they access it. They acquire their cannabis from other people who are consuming with them. So, for life has really changed for those folks. And another thing that's, I think, really potentially concerning, but really important to keep an eye on is we asked consumers about their mental health in light of the pandemic. And overall, different segments are having different experiences. We saw that younger consumers, so consumers aged 18 to 34, and female consumers are really not doing very well. I think half of women consumers reported that their mental health has worsened during the pandemic, compared to maybe 30% of men. And digging into that a little bit more, these segments that had the most negative mental health outcomes were also the groups that were most likely to consume cannabis socially before the pandemic. And this isn't talking, I'm not talking directly about the effects of, not being able to consume cannabis with other people, but what that indicates is that those groups were probably more social in general, maybe more extroverted, and with the changes of the last 8 months, haven't been able to engage in those things that make them feel well and well balanced. And that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on. It's something that I'm very concerned about. We also asked, in terms of mental health, how are people specifically using cannabis to improve their mental health? And more than half of them said that they were. So more than half of consumers are using cannabis specifically to address the mental health challenges that they're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I feel like we all joke about, pandemic or COVID-19 divorce and COVID-19 babies and all these different changes that are probably happening that are taking place on record levels, right? Because I don't know if people were meant to be trapped at home with their significant others, or, I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to be a huge change all around. And I think that consumption of cannabis or alcohol or whatever, it's going to have a major effect on these people, especially for someone that is used to being social and extroverted. And I know, even I think about the kids that are stuck home that are not able to socialize and the effect it's having on them. And it just seems like this whole, like you said, it's a social experiment that we're going to all have to be able to look back on. It's going to be pretty incredible.
And it's going to be years before we really understand, the if not decades before we really understand the effects of what we're all experiencing right now.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Well, we are almost out of time, but any final thoughts for our listeners, ladies?
I can jump in. I think so. Again, this goes back to my, just questions, things that I'm watching right now. Next week with Thanksgiving, we have one of the biggest cannabis sales days of the year is actually Green Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, has historically been, after 4/20, the largest day of cannabis sales of the year. And of course, this Thanksgiving is not typical in almost every way. So I'm really curious and going to be looking forward to finding out what effect, we talked about how consumers in general are using more, but also the fact that these spikes around holidays, which we also see around 4th of July and other, social holidays too, have to do with people gathering with their friends or their family and consuming together, which of course is really deeply interrupted this year. So that's just something I think that will be interesting to find out. I think we'll learn more about how consumers are behaving specifically around holidays and social use and communal use, but also their mental health use and all of that. I think we're going to learn a lot of that this week with Thanksgiving.
Well, I think this might be the first year. I mean, not the first year, but I know we saw posted in one of our channels a Forbes article about Thanksgiving recipes that are cannabis infused that people are putting out there to, quote unquote, keep your spirits high. So, yeah, it'll definitely be interesting. Kacey, any final thoughts?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. Thanks, Molly.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And as Molly mentioned, if you are not a newsletter subscriber, please sign up so you can be notified of our new COVID impact report coming out at the beginning of December. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I'll see you next time.